Welcome back to Weekend Express. You're watching Political Arena here on KTN News, and let's continue with our conversation, of course, with my analyst, a lawyer by profession and a frequent commentator on the topic, Areba Omwoyo Samba. Areba, before we went for the break, we talked of the possible scenarios that Ruto can do without Central Kenya. But I want us also to ponder of the remarks of, again, the Jubilee Vice Chairman, David Murathe, while speaking to Western leaders. He said, and I quote, "Give Central Kenya someone they can work with in the 2022 presidential election. Someone they can work with for any other position or for the presidential position." I'm sure you're not the one who said these statements, but from an analytical point of view, what could they be alluding to?
What comes out is that, as we are speaking currently, is that Central Kenya does not seem to have a preferred presidential candidate. And that is what is throwing all this confusion in the arena. Because we know that in Central Kenya, as some analysts have pondered, is that they vote to the last person. And for them not having a preferred political candidate as of now, then seems to bring in a lot of chaotic scenarios. If indeed they had a preferred candidate as of now, then, I mean, you couldn't be seeing this conversation. I've heard before Kimani Ichung'wah saying in a function in the Rift Valley that, indeed, as we're having a conversation about Rift Valley having a presidential candidate in the name of Dr. William Ruto, let's also think about what we Central Kenya are going to have. In that they started this conversation a long time ago that, indeed, we are not going into political oblivion. We also have something to put on the table. And the lack of having a preferred candidate at the moment is what is causing all these sins.
There are those who equally say and claim that the handshake, the maiden handshake between President Uhuru Kenyatta and Raila Odinga could have triggered jitters within Central Kenya and the politics of succession, and as far as who to back in 2022 is concerned. Do you view it that way as well?
From where I sit, I don't really see that the handshake really did much on this. Because initially, even before the handshake, this conversation had started. From my point of view, there is something different that a handshake was going to bring. And I will take you back to the political environment in the country and how we normally have a charged political environment. You remember during the tear gas Mondays and all, and during the IBC.
The protests.
The protests. The way the CBD was a combat zone, the way the CBD was a no-go zone. You know very well during the election period, the way some parts of the country are combat zones. No business can go on. And I see that when the two gentlemen in the president and Raila came together, they had that thought that indeed we, as much as we have the political side, we need the country to move forward economically. Because whenever we're having town as a combat zone, businesses are not able to be opened. People are not able to travel, which means that people are not able to work and pay taxes. At the end of the day, we are not going to have money going into the development. So from where I sit, I normally see that the handshake was more on how can we be able to do away with the toxic, in quotes, political environment, which then will be able to lead into a better economic environment.
So according to you, it wasn't going to shape the political environment in the 2022 race?
For me, I don't see that it was going to shape, unless now we are going to make it shape the political environment. You know, we live in a very interesting country where sometimes you might be seated here and somebody else thinks that when you're seated here, there is something else that you are doing. And it will be reported that we think that this is what they are doing, but then they have not come out to say that this is what we are doing. So unless as leaders and as politicians go out and make the handshake shape the 2022 political environment, my thinking is that that was not the agenda.
Let's talk of Central Kenya and what is going on at the moment. And I want us to ponder over as well of the remarks of Gatundu South Member of Parliament Moses Kuria, remarks that he later on apologized for and withdrew on the eve of the new year. He said, and I quote, "I want to say this, as we come to the end of 2018, I want you to think seriously about the habit of voting in large numbers only to end up in missing out on development projects." Why does it seem as though there is a sense of, if not a feeling, of the Central Kenya being neglected by the current president's regime? This, of course, the statement of Moses Kuria comes barely, I believe, 2 months after the Central Kenya legislators met in Naivasha to as well give a statement on their feeling about being neglected.
When the Naivasha meeting was held and we had attendance of around close to 70 legislators,
yes,
when they did their presser, they said that we have come together to see how we can collectively push for development. Now, this is the thinking that has come out from time to time, that whenever a regime gets into power, they try to woo the opposition areas by dishing out development. That is the thinking that has been for the longest time. I saw some bloggers serializing in terms of how many projects have been launched in Central vis-a-vis in other parts of the country. But for me, I find that as quite very baseless. Mm-hmm. There is something that we ushered in called devolution. Devolution was meant to cure all these irregularities in terms of development. And some quarters have reported that this war that you're seeing between Moses Kuria and was it Gathoni wa Mushomba?
Yes.
And the woman rep. Mm-hmm. This is a Kiambu-based kind of fist fight. And you saw the woman rep really responding that, hey, if Moses Kuria wants to be rehabilitated, I'm ready to rehabilitate him. Mm-hmm. So for me, I don't see this as a whole central kind of conversation. I see it as a Kiambu-based conversation.
Despite 70 lawmakers meeting 2 months ago in Naivasha saying that the area was underdeveloped?
When the 70 lawmakers met in Naivasha, the conversation was around still the 2022. But then they didn't want to come out clearly and say that this is a conversation about 2022. Whenever a press release is done for you to think of what they had in mind. But the real conversation had happened about the 2022. Mm-hmm. So for me, and which other legislator have you had from Central also complaining about the issues?
But there were political new parties that were registered.
I mean, political parties are registered everywhere.
Signaling somewhat.
Even Kisii people have registered a new political party. I mean, the Central people will always be loyal. That is one thing that you need to realize. And they will still vote to the last person. Right now, they're trying to have some kind of self-realization in that we are not going to have a presidential candidate. What are we going to do with ourselves? I think that is the kind of conversations that are going on. There are those people who will support Moses Kuria. There are those people who will be bashing them. Mm-hmm. But then the conversation is about, we don't have a preferred presidential candidate. How do we move on?
For an area that has produced the country's founding father, the country's first president, the country's third president, and now the country's fourth president, yes, should they legitimately decry of underdevelopment?
No. I think sometimes we need to really be realistic in terms of what we are speaking. I think even if you take a drive through most parts of Central, the parts are relatively developed. Mm-hmm. All that we can be able to talk about now is that how can the devolved units also move that forward? Remember, we do not have always to develop to depend on the central government. That is why we have devolved units. Mm-hmm. The central government and the devolved units need to work in synergy and see how to move forward. So for me, I don't really find the cry that it's a legitimate cry that we are underdeveloped. They claim that charity begins at home. But at the end of the day, this is a president of the whole country. This is a president of people who did not vote for him and people who voted for him. Remember that we're in a democratic society where at the end of the day, the majority will have their way and the minority will at least have their say. But then the president is a unifying factor. This is a symbol of unity. So he does not really have to concentrate on one region. The reason why I said that this is a Kiambu war, you had Moses Kuria asking that who invites the president to come and award certificates to drunkards? Mm-hmm. And the women rep went back and said, you have 100 million to develop. Why can't you invite the president to come and launch projects by CDF? Mm-hmm. Then Moses Kuria went further and said that in Kiambu, we invite the president to quote-unquote launch drunkards. But in other parts of Central, the president opens significant projects. I think he was in Nyeri before, mm-hmm, and he launched some projects. So what I'm coming to is that this is some kind of Kiambu kind of tug wars which are going on based on the 2022 succession plan. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Talking of the 2022 succession plan and politics, there's of course as well the talks of President Uhuru Kenyatta, that is the Kenyatta family.
Yes.
Raila Odinga, the Odinga family, and now the Moi family. Is there a possibility of all the three, what is largely known as dynasties, coming together to as well chant a way forward?
I think these are people who have enjoyed some kind of friendship from the past. And there is somebody who tried to discredit the reason why Raila Odinga is in Mombasa and why probably reportedly he might have met the president. And one other person responded that, you see, these are people who have been friends before. These are people who trace their history, or rather trace their journey during the pre-colonial period. So as far as them meeting together and chanting a way forward, it's a remote possibility. But one thing you need to notice is that the person of the deputy president and his allies, they're very alive of that fact. And they're very clear that at the end of the day, if push comes to shove, he's going to go it alone. He's not going to depend on anybody to come and say, hey, you need to be endorsed or so. And one commentator has a very funny analogy on this issue, that whereas one person is waiting to be endorsed and probably ride on the name of his father or the name of other people's fathers who are friends, this other person has decided to go out all guns blazing. Just an example, how many meetings did Gideon Moi do over the festive period? Vis-a-vis how many meetings did the deputy president do in Sugoi? So you see the kind of separation that is now, as we move forward, the kind of separation that is coming in that the deputy president is trying to make it clear that, hey, I'm ready to just walk alone and campaign alone.
Talking of walking alone, the Rift Valley region voted unanimously,
yes,
and to a large extent for Jubilee in the 2013 and both in the 2017 elections. Now that there is seemingly two political kingpins who equally have, through their words or their actions, shown interest in the presidential position, that is Deputy President William Ruto and, of course, Baringo Senator Gideon Moi. Is there a rift, therefore, in the rift equally as well?
There is a small rift in the Rift Valley, but then...
will it expand with time?
I don't think it's going to expand. I think that as time goes by, it's going to narrow down. Look at what happened in Bomet recently. We are seeing that some other people who felt left out in the 2017, and those people who had developed splinter groups, are being united now under one front. That is why you recently saw that the Bomet governor and the contestant, the CCM party leader, then Isaac Ruto and Joyce Laboso, they are now together. Why? Because they're trying to now come together and still redevelop that strength in numbers. And also equally, on the north side, we see that Nanok, there has been talks that Nanok is having conversation with the deputy president. Now, we will be keen to see what the Baringo senator now has in store for us for this year. So that while these other people are also making the inroads within at home, trying to unify the home area and having that charity begin at home, what will we also be doing? Will we go out and make more allies than Alfred Keter, Kamket and company? So that then at the end of the day, we try to develop that so-called rift so that then it can be bigger. But for me, I think it's going to narrow down. More and more enemies are going to come together to be friends for one purpose. If
the two leaders who have shown interest in the presidential position are, of course, on two political parties, seemingly driving in two different directions, that rift seems as though it's not narrowing down any time.
The reason I'm saying it's going to narrow down is because they're going to create allies within the region. They're going to create some friendship within the region, so that at the end of the day, they have that unity of purpose. My analogy is based on the 2017 elections. Remember that in some regions, we had, like in Bomet, for example, we had two different parties, but one presidential candidate. You saw that CCM also had a fair share of its votes, but they have come together. You go to the likes of Nandi Hills MP Alfred Keter. You saw that as much as he was championing the Jubilee agenda, he was still not very comfortable at home. You saw what he has gone through. My thinking is that as time goes by, they're going to reunite within at home and come out. But my point is that they don't need that unity at home. They need to go out and look for more votes. They need to go and probably convince Wetangula not to vie for the presidency, and Mudavadi and probably Atwoli, so that then they can join allies from other regions.
Speaking of the rift, Deputy President William Ruto, of course, responding to what Jubilee Vice Chairman David Murathe said, he said, I'm ready to battle with anyone.
Yes.
Let my competitors put on the table what they have done for the country. That to battle with anyone, what are the logical possibilities of a reunification beside Jubilee for the Deputy President?
In politics, I think a single day has a lot of changes that are going to come through. And before David Murathi's remarks, the deputy president and his allies were, at least in my understanding, sitting pretty and knowing that everything is going on well. But when these statements started coming out, the deputy president came out and said, hey, I'm not waiting for anybody's endorsement. I'm going to battle it out. And I'm going to show what I've done for this country. So as time goes by, I know he's going to bring people from the western part of the country. He's going to bring a number of people. You see, now he has a very strong fighter in the name of Boni Halwale, who was his sworn enemy some times back. So he's going to try and galvanize other parts of the country. If you go to Kisii area, he's virtually in Kisii after every 2 months. And he's been able to create a cloud for himself in Kisii. So when he comes to the table with these people, even without the central region, he's going at least to have some kind of considerable number of votes going on the table.
And can he do without central region? I bet that is the question on the lips of everyone.
That is the question. Now my analogy will be based on these other regions are not well known as voters. Central region is a well-known, I mean, there are voters there and they vote. That is what creates the difference between Western region and the Central region. Whereas the Western region equally has a high number of registered voters, they don't vote. So unless he has something that is going to entice these people and probably create in them the ability to vote to their last person, then he can be able to do without the Central region. But if he's just going to have all these people and they are not going to vote, then it's just not going to make any sense.
In the event that President Uhuru Kenyatta silently, of course, leaves the political scene without endorsing or even recommending anyone to fill up the position he's leaving, which is the presidency, of course, Central Kenya, my question is, will Central Kenya then have a president on their own, or they will have to realign their interest equally as well?
My thinking is that for the 2022, they have to have a preferred presidential candidate. When I look around Central, I don't think that they have somebody ready for the presidential race in 2022. So then they have to have somebody preferred for them to wait for the next time. So the reason why we are having all these conversations at the moment again is because they have not settled on a preferred presidential candidate. That is the reason why we are having this kind of chaotic scenario. If they could have settled and had a clear direction on who to vote for in 2022, trust you me, they'll be quiet at the moment. But since they have not settled, they're still soul-searching, they're still looking around whether it will be Mudavadi or Wetangula, they're still looking around whether they will go for, I don't know whether from Kisii there's somebody who has developed interest, or they're going for Joho. That is a factor that as time goes by, once they settle on a particular presidential candidate, they'll be quiet. And probably what you need to realize is that the Kenyan politics and the Kenya party system is tribal-led. The tribal leader, at the end of the day, assumes the position of the party leader. So whenever this party leader, who's again some kind of tribal kingpin, does not speak out, the masses are left in an array, and that is what's happening in Central. And remember, the president has come out and say, hey, this is no time for politics. I have the Big Four agenda. They're really pushing him to be like, hey, tell us, be straight and say that this is the preferred presidential candidate. But then he knows that at the moment, he needs to work well with even the opposition, and he needs to move forward and move the Big Four agenda in the right direction.
Areba, as we conclude this conversation, what will the role of Raila Odinga, a man whom we haven't talked much of in the show today, be in the pursuit of anyone's presidential ambition come 2022?
Raila Odinga, this is a man during the first round of the 2017 elections, got more than 4 million votes. So this is a man who still has a considerable say in the political environment. And you cannot overrule him, and he still comes up with his side with his side of supporters, both in his backyard in Nyanza and other parts of the country. So he's going to have a large say. And that is why also you've seen some of his lieutenants also coming out and saying that Raila is not too old for the presidency. I mean, they're also pushing him to give him direction, because he has not come out to speak about 2022.
Should he not vie? Let's speak on his behalf a little bit. Should he not vie in the 2022 elections? What will be the importance of one seeking, quote-unquote, the blessings and the endorsement of such a person?
It will be very important, because there are people who listen to Raila Odinga as if like this is a person they really adore. This is a person they listen to the last ear. So it will be very important that whoever wants to go on that side has to go and get the quote-unquote blessings from him. But you realize that in politics also there are people who are trying to create some kind of splinter group from his main, from Raila's clout. You've seen some kind of inroads into that region. You've seen the Obados and so, trying to at least divide this clout which Raila Odinga enjoys. But at the end of the day, whoever wants to be the president of this country, I mean, cannot ignore Raila Odinga.
Fair enough. Areba Omwoyo Samba, a lawyer and a frequent commentator on current affairs. Gentlemen, many thanks for making time for us this morning. Thank you so much. And a happy new year.
Happy New Year.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's edition of Weekend Express with me, Abu Bakar Abdullahi. On behalf of the entire team that made this production possible, thanks for watching. Bye for now, but enjoy the rest of our programs.